In this video, we're going to take a quick look at fungus, the kingdom fungi. So what is a fungus? Well, we can define a fungus as being eukaryotic, of course, because they're not bacteria, multicellular, with an exception, heterotrophic, meaning they have to find nutrient, they have to feed, they can't make their own food. Specifically, we're going to find that all fungus feed by the process of absorption. They have a cell wall, which makes them unique from animal cells, and they reproduce and disperse their offspring by means of spores. Now when we look around the world, we see lots of different types of fungus. There's about 80,000 known species, and there's an estimated 1 million species that are unknown. As we scroll down, we can see just the great diversity and variety of different fungi. The typical mushroom we might be familiar with, but there's lots of other different versions of fungus that we can see as we scroll down, including the yeast, our exception, our single-celled fungus, these aspergillus here, and bread mold. That's bread mold, looking up close at bread mold there. So lots of different types of fungus. Now, before we get into some of the other details, the first thing we need to look at is the nutritional modes. Like we said, all fungus are heterotrophic. They must feed. But they can go about this in a couple different ways. Many fungus are what we call saprobes. A saprobe is a decomposer. A saprobe is something that lives off decaying matter. So when you see a mushroom growing up out of the ground, it's not growing like a plant, generating food from the sun. It's actually feeding, like this down here, this mushroom. They're feeding off the decaying matter, the nutrients, the organic material here on the soil. This picture we see bread mold. Let's make this a little bigger. Bread mold, and the bread is actually the mold is actually feeding on the bread and breaking it down. And in this picture we see a fungus growing on looks like a log of some sort, and so it's breaking that log down and decomposing it. So fungus can be saprobes or saprobic, meaning they decomposers. But some fungus are parasitic. For example, athlete's foot is a parasitic fungus. And by parasitic means that it's living on a host, a living host, and it's doing damage to that living host. And there are some fungus that live in mutualistic relationships. In a mutualistic relationship, both partners in the symbiosis benefit. So if we take a quick detour here and look at some of its vocabulary, the word symbiosis means to live together. But there are different types of symbiosis, and many times people use the word symbiosis when they really should be more specific and be using the term mutualistic or mutualism. Because parasitism by definition is a form of symbiosis, but it's one in which one of the participants benefits and the other one's harmed. And then there's commensalism, a type of symbiosis where one of the participants benefits and the other is neither harmed nor helped. And then of course mutualism, it's a win-win relationship. So let's get back to nutritional modes. One of the big things we're going to be discussing is, because it relates to their form, is what fungus are doing. Well, they're feeding by digesting the material that they're growing on by a process called extracellular digestion. This doesn't mean extra cells. By this extra we mean outside of the cell, as opposed to intracellular digestion. We have extracellular digestion, meaning the fungus doesn't bring a food particle in and then digest it. In fact, it does the opposite. It digests the food and then absorbs the already digested material. So this bread mold down here is secreting enzymes onto the surface of the bread, which breaks down the bread into its components, and then it absorbs those components across its cell body. The same with this fungus and this fungus. That's how fungus feed. Well, any structure that or organism that's going to feed by absorption, it's got to have some certain quality. I want you to stop for a second and think. If your feeding process or mechanism relies on absorbing materials across your body, what can you then suggest or predict as to kind of the type of body you need to have? What's the key issue? Now, stop and think about that for a moment. If you're going to feed by absorption, you need to have a lot of surface area. You have to have a lot of surface area across which you can absorb those nutrients. Well, what that does is point us to the next thing we need to talk about, which is the body plan. What are a fungus? We look at a mushroom like this one, we think that that's a fungus, but in fact, this is just one stage in the life of a fungus. Most of the fungus grows down on the ground or grows along a surface. The primary structure of a fungus is that fungus are composed of highly branched filaments called hyphae. So here is a single hypha, and here are many hyphae. A mass of these hyphae equals a mycelium. And if you think of a structure that's long and thin and highly branched like this, it's going to give you a large overall surface area. And a large overall surface area is good when you're an absorber, when you feed by absorption. So their body plan, their form, relates to the function of feeding by absorption. A couple other things we need to look at while we're here. This highly branched hyphae, these mycelium. If we look inside of one of these branches, it's not uncommon in the fungus to see cell division occur. So here's one nucleus. Let me circle this. Here's a nucleus, and here's a nucleus, so we had mitosis occur. But notice that both those nuclei are trapped in the same compartments. It's very common in fungus to have cell division without full cross walls forming. And the result is that we have these, whoops, wrong one, I thought I had my highlighter. The result is that we have these compartments that are multinucleate or have more than one nucleus in them. And that's going to come into play later when we look at some of the reproductive process where we're going to have the fusion of these two nuclei in order to reproduce. So this multinucleate situation where we have two nuclei into one compartment is not uncommon in the structure of fungus. And finally, from a standpoint of just kind of getting our notes done, that's a quality of fungus. The cell walls are made of a carbohydrate or polysaccharide called chitin. I like to point that out because the cell walls of plant cells are made of a different carbohydrate, cellulose, and the cell walls in bacteria are made of a different carbohydrate altogether called peptidoglycan. And chitin is a material that we find in some animal species. The exoskeleton of arthropods is made of chitin, so when you step on a bug and it crunches, that crunches the chitin. And if you peel shrimp, that's chitinous. That's a carbohydrate. So the cell walls of fungus are made of chitin. So to recap, structure of fungus. They're built from these highly branched, these thin branches, filaments called hyphae, a mass of which is a mycelium, and overall that gives us a lot of surface area. And good surface area is important if you're an absorber, if you feed by absorption. Which really brings us to the next question. If fungus feed by absorption, okay, and they grow on what they feed, what is, if any, is the benefit for growing upwards? Think about that. If the stuff you're feeding on is down here, and you can grow out along it, spreading out, absorbing the nutrients that you digest extracellularly, why ever would you grow in this direction upwards? Doesn't make sense. There's no food up here. All the food is down here below. So you would want to grow this way, right? All down here along the decaying matter. But what's the purpose of growing upwards? Stop the video and think about that and see if you can come up with an answer. So here's a drawing. The fungus, most of it's down here below, under the leaves and soil, feeding on the decaying matter, dropping digestive enzymes, absorbing nutrients. Why spend the energy and resources, raw materials, to grow upwards? Well, I hope you came up with this answer. The answer has to do with reproduction. Fungus reproduce using spores. So before getting into the process, let's imagine we have a spore and we produce the spore somewhere down here. So we produce a spore and then that spore drops here and that spore starts to grow into a new fungus. Well, this new baby fungus has to outcompete with the parent who's already established. So the chances of this fungus outcompeting this established fungus as far as finding food is pretty slim. But if we grow upwards and we produce a spore here, and this tiny spore, this single cell, falls out of this fungus, gets caught by the wind, it could get carried a very great distance and land way over here and start to grow, creating its hyphae. And then it's not having to compete with the parent. So the benefit of growing up is singular. The only reason for a fungus ever to grow up and form what we call a fruiting body is to aid in spore dispersal. Since we're talking now about reproduction in the fungus, the next logical thing is to talk, since we're talking about fruiting bodies and growing upwards to disperse spores, we need to then move on to reproduction in fungus. Well, fungus reproduce asexually using spores, and they have structures that are specifically modified for producing spores, and those structures that produce the spores are called sporangia. So let's recall what a spore is. A spore is a single cell. It's a walled cell structure that's haploid, and it will eventually germinate or grow after it's dispersed, and it will grow into our new organism. The way we classify and look at our groups of fungus is that the basis of putting a fungus into one group or another is determined by what the spore producing structure is. We're going to have three groups: zygomycota, basidiomycota, and ascomycota. And these three groups are determined based on what the name or the shape of the structure that produces the that produces the spore. So the zygomycota produce the spore in the zygospore, the basidiomycota produce the spore in the basidia, and the ascomycota produces the spore in a structure called the ascus. So the spores, once produced, are dispersed by wind or water. They can travel great distances, which again gets them away from the parent so they don't have to compete with the parent. And they can produce millions of these spores. And the sexually reproducing forms are called fruiting bodies. Like I said, they grow upwards. And in there we will have a sexual reproduction where gametes are produced and the gametes will fuse. Now we're going to have to look at the reproductive cycles of the different groups, but we're going to come back for the next video. And the next video will be on like the fungus classification, diversity, and for each one of these three groups we'll look at the sexual reproductive cycle. But I wanted to show you a glimpse of the reproductive cycle, kind of a generic one, and show you that it's built off of what we've already learned in our alternation of generation life cycle, but with a twist. And the twist is that we have a very dominant haploid stage, and the diploid stage is very short-lived. So I don't have my board here. I'm doing this since I don't have my board to draw on to do a clean drawing. I'll just show you an old drawing that I've done, and I apologize ahead of time, it's not very clean. But here is our growing fungus, and when it's time to reproduce sexually, it grows upwards, creating a fruiting body. And inside this fruiting body, two gametes are formed by mitosis to make these haploid gametes. And inside this structure, these gametes will fuse by fertilization, producing a diploid zygote. Now this is our diploid stage in our alternation of generations life cycle, but this diploid stage doesn't live independently. It doesn't grow a diploid fungus. Inside this structure, inside this sporangia, which is the spore-producing structure, meiosis will occur, taking this diploid zygote, remember meiosis is the reduction division, and producing haploid spores. And the haploid spores are released and disperse, land on the ground, and grow into a new gametophyte generation, a new fungus. And if you recall, that looks very similar to our alternation generation life cycle, except that we don't have an independent diploid growing stage. So come back for the next video on fungus diversity and reproduction, and we'll go through some of the different groups and the structures involved and how we classify fungus differently based on the reproductive structure. Ready for the under 1 minute recap? Fungus are eukaryotic, multicellular, heterotrophic, feeding by absorption. They have cell walls made of chitin, and they reproduce and disperse spores. All fungus are heterotrophic. They can be saprobes, living off decomposers, living off decaying matter. They can be parasitic, feeding on a host, or they can be in a mutualistic relationship that we're going to see in the next video, where they help with the organism they live on. All digestion is done extracellularly, with the digestion occurring outside the cell and then being absorbed across the fungus body. Since fungus rely on absorption to feed, they must have structures that are large in surface area. When we look at the basic body plan of a fungus, we see a structure that is very large in surface area. There's highly branched filaments of hyphae, a mass of which is a mycelium, which is excellent for being an absorptive structure. So then the question is why we would ever grow up, and the answer to why you would grow up is in order to aid in spore dispersal. All fungus are reproduced using these spores, and the divisions of fungus are based on the spore producing structure. Come back for the next video.